The cruelest jokes are the ones that ask decent people to laugh at someone else's loneliness. Marcus Reed noticed the phones before he noticed the woman. 3 glowing screens tilted just enough to hide their purpose, but not enough to fool a man who had spent years reading rooms before speaking inside them. The Ashford House restaurant shimmered beneath warm amber lights, every crystal glass catching reflections from the grand chandelier above, while a jazz trio played softly near the fireplace. It was the kind of place where anniversaries were celebrated, proposals were whispered, and strangers smiled at one another without ever asking names. Tonight, however, something felt different. The laughter near the bar was too carefully restrained. The glances were too deliberate. Marcus adjusted the sleeves of his charcoal button-down shirt and quietly thanked the hostess before following her toward the table reserved under his first name. In his jacket pocket rested a single white gardenia wrapped in a folded napkin. His 9-year-old daughter, Lily, had insisted he bring it. She had picked it from the tiny flower bed beside their porch that morning and tucked it into his hand before school with a smile that reminded him painfully of her mother. "If she's nervous, Daddy, flowers help people feel safe," she had said. Marcus almost smiled remembering those words. Then he saw her. Eleanor Whitmore sat alone near the window overlooking the city lights. Her silver hair rested neatly against the collar of an elegant navy dress, and a small oak-shaped brooch caught the glow from the candles on the table. She looked poised, graceful, and unmistakably older than the woman Travis had described. But it wasn't her age that caught Marcus's attention. It was her expression. She had already figured it out. Her fingers rested quietly on her purse as though preparing to leave before anyone had the chance to laugh directly in her face. She wasn't embarrassed because of Marcus. She was embarrassed because someone had arranged this evening hoping both of them would become entertainment. Marcus's eyes drifted toward the bar. Travis stood beside Ashley with 2 other co-workers, pretending to watch a basketball game mounted above the shelves of expensive whiskey. None of them were looking at the television. Every few seconds, one of them glanced toward table 12. One man even held his phone chest high, pretending to answer a message while the camera lens faced directly toward Eleanor. Marcus understood everything without hearing a single word. They weren't waiting for a date. They were waiting for a reaction. They expected outrage. They expected discomfort. They expected the black single father to look offended after discovering his blind date was nearly 20 years older than him. They expected the older woman to apologize for existing. Instead, Marcus walked past the empty chair, turned toward the people pretending not to watch, and spoke just loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear. "If this evening was meant to humiliate someone, you picked the wrong woman and the wrong man." The quiet spread faster than the music could fill it. A waiter froze in mid-step. A couple celebrating a birthday stopped talking. Even Travis lowered his phone. Marcus turned back toward Eleanor as though no audience existed at all. He gently pulled out her chair before taking the gardenia from his pocket and laying it beside her water glass. "My daughter thought flowers make strangers feel a little less nervous," he said with an easy smile. I hope she was right. Eleanor looked at the flower for several silent seconds. Something in her eyes softened, not because of romance, but because kindness had arrived where humiliation had been carefully prepared. She glanced once toward the bar, then back at Marcus. "Your daughter sounds wiser than most adults I've met," she answered quietly. Marcus finally took his seat. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its conversations, but the people with phones lowered them one by one. Whatever spectacle they had expected had disappeared before it ever began. Eleanor reached toward the flower, her fingertips barely brushing one white petal. For the briefest moment, her hand paused above the small oak brooch pinned to her dress, and Marcus noticed the way she instinctively touched it, almost as if it carried a memory too precious to explain. He didn't know why the symbol felt strangely familiar, only that somewhere deep inside him it awakened a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The morning had begun the way most mornings did inside the little blue house on Maple Street, with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the kitchen before sunrise and the quiet rhythm of Marcus Reed sanding the edge of a handmade bookshelf in the garage. He always worked for 30 minutes before waking Lily because those peaceful moments reminded him that even broken wood could become something beautiful again if enough patience was applied. The soft scrape of sandpaper stopped the instant he heard small footsteps racing across the hallway. Lily appeared wearing mismatched socks, oversized glasses she did not actually need, and a backpack that looked almost too big for her shoulders. "You started without me," she said, pretending to sound disappointed. Marcus smiled as he brushed sawdust from his hands. "I thought third graders were supposed to sleep in." Lily folded her arms. "Not when pancakes are involved." Within minutes, the kitchen filled with laughter instead of silence. Marcus flipped pancakes while Lily carefully arranged blueberries into smiling faces, insisting every breakfast deserved at least one reason to smile before the school day began. Their conversations were never rushed. They talked about spelling tests, library books, neighborhood dogs, and whether squirrels secretly remembered every person who fed them. Those ordinary moments had become sacred after Rachel passed away 6 years earlier. Marcus had promised himself that no matter how busy work became, Lily would never remember her childhood as a house where her father was always too distracted to listen. As they ate, Lily noticed a plain white envelope resting beside his coffee mug. She recognized Travis's handwriting immediately because he had dropped it off the previous afternoon while Marcus was still working in the shop. "Are you really going?" she asked. Marcus took a slow sip before answering. "I have not decided." Lily tilted her head. "That means yes." He laughed softly. "You know me too well." Inside, the envelope was the invitation to the blind date. Travis had spent weeks insisting that Marcus needed to meet someone new, describing the woman as thoughtful, independent, and somewhere around his own age. Marcus had refused every suggestion since Rachel's funeral. It was never because he believed loving Rachel meant closing the door forever. It was because he had not yet figured out how to open another door without feeling as though he was leaving one behind. Lily reached across the table and gently tapped the envelope with one finger. "Daddy, can I tell you something without you giving me the grown-up answer?" Marcus nodded. "Always." She looked down at her plate before speaking. "I do not want another mom because I already had the best one." Marcus swallowed quietly. "Neither do I." She smiled. "That is not what I mean. I just do not want you pretending you are finished living because mom is gone. She loved you too much for that." The words settled into the room with surprising weight. Marcus looked toward the hallway where a framed photograph of Rachel still rested on the entry table. In the picture, she was laughing at something outside the frame, her hair caught by the wind, holding Lily when she was barely 2 years old. He remembered the promise he whispered beside her hospital bed, that he would protect their daughter, teach her kindness, and never let grief become the loudest voice inside their home. Perhaps somewhere along the way he had mistaken protecting Lily for hiding from life itself. After breakfast, he walked Lily to school, and before she climbed out of the truck, she reached into the small flower bed near the sidewalk and carefully picked a single white gardenia. She placed it into his hand with complete confidence. "If she is nervous," Lily said, "flowers help people feel safe. And if she is not the right person, you still made someone's day a little brighter." Marcus looked at the flower for a long moment before placing it carefully inside his jacket pocket, never imagining that by evening it would become the first honest thing anyone brought to a table built on someone else's cruel expectations. Across town, the afternoon sunlight drifted quietly across the hardwood floors of Eleanor Whitmore's lake house, painting long golden reflections beneath shelves lined with books collected over a lifetime. At 55, Eleanor had grown accustomed to living in peaceful silence. It was not the peaceful silence people imagined when they looked at photographs of her elegant home in magazines or charity newsletters. It was the kind that settled in after the front door closed behind the last guest, after the dishes had been put away, after another evening ended with no one sitting across the table. Richard had been gone for nearly 8 years, yet she still found herself setting 2 coffee cups on quiet Saturday mornings before gently smiling at her own absent-minded habit and returning one to the cabinet. Some routines were simply another name for love refusing to disappear. Since Richard's passing, friends had tried more than once to introduce her to someone new. Charity board members arranged dinners. Old neighbors suggested widowers they considered suitable companions. A family friend once insisted she deserved a second chapter. Every invitation had ended the same way. The conversations rarely lasted beyond polite introductions before the questions shifted toward the foundation, the properties, the board, the investments, or the influence attached to her last name. People often admired Eleanor Whitmore before they ever bothered to know Eleanor. Eventually, declining invitations became easier than wondering whether anyone across the table truly saw the woman instead of the reputation. Earlier that week, Ashley Monroe had approached her after a fundraising luncheon with refreshing sincerity, or so it had seemed. Ashley described a quiet widower named Marcus who devoted his life to raising his daughter, worked with his hands, avoided social events, and cared more about character than appearances. Ashley intentionally described him as someone close to Eleanor's own stage of life, carefully leaving out that he was considerably younger. It was not meant to ruin anyone's evening. Ashley honestly believed the unexpected age difference would create an amusing story for co-workers who enjoyed harmless office gossip. She never imagined two lonely people might actually find genuine connection. Eleanor hesitated before accepting. Then she remembered the promise she had made beside her closest friend's hospital bed 2 years earlier. "Do not let loneliness become your identity," her friend had whispered. "You are allowed to meet tomorrow without betraying yesterday." Those words had stayed with Eleanor ever since. She walked slowly toward her study to retrieve her purse, but her attention drifted to a weathered cedar box resting on the corner of an old writing desk. She had not intended to open it. Somehow she always did whenever life asked her to trust someone new. Inside lay dozens of handwritten letters from scholarship recipients whose lives had crossed paths with the Whitmore Scholars Foundation over the past 2 decades. Some described becoming teachers. Others became nurses, engineers, social workers, or small business owners. None of them spoke about money. Every page spoke about opportunity. Eleanor smiled as she thumbed gently through the stack until her fingers paused on one envelope wrapped beneath a faded blue ribbon. She recognized the handwriting immediately. It was one of the few letters she had read more times than she could remember, though she had not opened it in years. The ribbon covered most of the signature, leaving only the first sweeping strokes of a name visible before disappearing beneath the fabric. She considered removing the ribbon, then quietly stopped herself. "Another day," she whispered, sliding the letter carefully back into place before closing the lid. She crossed the room toward her bedroom and opened the velvet jewelry case resting on her dresser. Rows of elegant necklaces, diamond earrings, and gold bracelets reflected the afternoon light, gifts from grateful donors and community leaders collected over many years. She reached past every expensive piece and lifted a simple silver oak leaf brooch instead. The tiny pin had almost no monetary value, yet it remained the only piece she wore whenever she needed to remember why the foundation had been created in the first place. It had arrived years earlier from a young teacher whose future had been changed by a scholarship and whose gratitude had quietly outlived every award Eleanor had ever received. She fastened the brooch carefully to the collar of her navy dress, picked up her purse, and studied her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back still carried grief, wisdom, and hope in equal measure. Eleanor offered herself the smallest of smiles. "One honest conversation is enough," she said softly. "If tonight gives me only that, it will already be more than I expected." Marcus waited until the waiter filled their water glasses before speaking again. He had discovered years earlier that silence, when given enough room, often invited honesty more effectively than clever conversation ever could. Eleanor smiled politely, still uncertain whether the evening could recover from the awkward beginning. "I suppose we should acknowledge the obvious," she said at last. "We were both given incomplete information." Marcus nodded. "That is one way to describe it." A quiet laugh escaped her. "You expected someone younger." He met her eyes without hesitation. "I expected someone different because someone chose to leave out important details. Those are not the same thing." Eleanor looked down at the white gardenia resting beside her plate. Most people would have walked away. Marcus folded his hands on the table. Walking away would have made their story true. She looked up. Their story. Marcus glanced briefly toward the bar where Travis and Ashley were pretending not to watch. That two strangers could be turned into a joke simply because someone decided neither of them deserved basic respect. Eleanor followed his gaze, finally noticing another phone quietly lowered behind a glass of sparkling water. She sighed almost imperceptibly. "I should have recognized it sooner." "Recognized what?" Marcus asked. "The look," she answered. "The look people wear when they are waiting for disappointment to entertain them." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The jazz music floated gently through the dining room, while waiters moved gracefully between candlelit tables. The restaurant slowly regained its comfortable rhythm, but an invisible line had already separated Marcus and Eleanor from everyone else in the room. They were no longer strangers sharing an awkward blind date. They had become two people quietly surviving the same misunderstanding. The waiter returned with menus and recommended the evening specials. Marcus thanked him sincerely before asking Eleanor if she preferred to order first. She smiled. "You are surprisingly calm." "Not always," he admitted. "I have simply learned that reacting quickly usually benefits the loudest person in the room." Eleanor closed her menu. "Your daughter taught you that?" Marcus smiled. "Sometimes I think she teaches me everything." He spoke about Lily without exaggeration, describing a curious little girl who believed pancakes tasted better when shaped like stars, and who still waved goodbye every morning until she could no longer see his truck. He described helping with science projects, repairing bicycles, reading novels together every Friday night, and trying very hard not to embarrass her at school concerts. Eleanor listened carefully, noticing that he never once described fatherhood as a sacrifice. He spoke about it as though it had quietly become the greatest privilege of his life. "She lost her mother very young," Marcus said softly. "Some days she remembers little details that surprise me. Other days she asks questions that I cannot answer." Eleanor nodded with understanding that needed no explanation. "Loss changes shape," she whispered. "It never really disappears." Marcus looked at her for a moment before asking, "May I ask about your family?" Eleanor rested both hands around her water glass. "My husband passed away several years ago. My son lives in Washington. He calls every Sunday exactly at 6 o'clock whether he has time or not." Marcus smiled warmly. "That sounds like someone who loves you." "He does," Eleanor replied. "He simply worries more than he realizes." Their dinners arrived just as a young waitress accidentally caught the edge of Eleanor's water glass while setting down a plate. The glass tipped sideways, spilling water across the tablecloth. The waitress immediately apologized, her face turning bright red with embarrassment. Before she could reach for extra napkins, Marcus was already standing. Without the slightest hint of annoyance, he helped steady the dishes while gently reassuring her that accidents happen to everyone. Eleanor noticed something remarkable. The young waitress relaxed almost instantly because Marcus spoke to her with the same quiet respect he had shown Eleanor from the moment he sat down. There was no performance in his kindness. There was no audience he hoped to impress. It was simply the way he had chosen to move through the world, and for reasons she could not yet explain, that simple truth lingered in Eleanor's heart far longer than any carefully planned blind date ever could. By the time dessert menus appeared, the atmosphere around Marcus and Eleanor had changed in a way neither of them expected. Their conversation had become effortless, filled with thoughtful pauses instead of awkward silence. They spoke about favorite books, childhood memories, and the strange comfort of old family recipes that never tasted exactly the same after the person who created them was gone. Eleanor found herself laughing more than she had in months. Marcus noticed that every time she laughed, the years seemed to disappear from her face, replaced by the warmth of someone who had simply been waiting for a reason to smile again. Across the restaurant, however, disappointment was beginning to spread among the small audience that had gathered around Travis and Ashley. This was not unfolding the way they had imagined. There had been no argument, no uncomfortable exit, no embarrassed apology. Their harmless joke, as they had called it earlier that afternoon, was quietly failing. Ashley glanced down at her phone and frowned. The short video she had secretly recorded when Marcus first entered the restaurant showed nothing except a gentleman pulling out a chair for a woman. There was nothing humiliating about kindness. "Do something," she whispered to Travis. "This is boring." Travis slipped his phone into his pocket and forced an exaggerated smile before walking toward table 12 with Ashley following a step behind. Marcus noticed them immediately but remained seated. Eleanor also saw them, approaching, and instinctively straightened her posture. She had spent enough years attending public events to recognize when trouble was dressed as friendliness. "Well," Travis announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, "this seems to be going better than expected." Marcus smiled politely. "Good evening, Travis." Ashley looked at Eleanor before turning toward Marcus with a playful grin that never reached her eyes. "I hope we did not surprise you too much. We figured experience might be exactly what you needed." A few quiet chuckles drifted from the bar. Eleanor lowered her eyes toward the tablecloth. Marcus noticed the change immediately. She had carried herself with confidence all evening, yet a single careless sentence had managed to make her feel as though she were being measured instead of seen. Travis leaned against the empty chair beside their table. "Come on, Marcus. You have to admit this was unexpected. We were taking bets on whether you would stay longer than 5 minutes." Marcus remained calm. "I am sorry to hear that." Travis blinked. "That is all you have to say?" "For now." Ashley folded her arms. "You should be thanking us. It is not every day someone agrees to spend an evening with a busy single father." Marcus slowly placed his napkin beside his plate before looking directly at Ashley. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Do you know what disappoints me most about tonight?" Neither Ashley nor Travis answered. "It is not that you misled me. It is not even that you thought I would leave. It is that you invited a good woman here believing her age would be the punchline." The restaurant grew noticeably quieter. A nearby waiter paused beside another table, pretending to refill water while listening without appearing obvious. Ashley forced a laugh. "You are taking this far too seriously." Marcus shook his head. "No, I am taking her seriously." He turned slightly toward Eleanor before continuing. "Someone's years are evidence that they have survived joy, disappointment, loss, hope, and everything in between. That is not something to mock. That is something to respect." Travis shifted uncomfortably. It was only supposed to be a joke. Marcus looked at him with calm eyes that carried no anger, only disappointment. A joke makes everyone laugh. Humiliation only entertains the people causing it. No one at the neighboring tables smiled anymore. Ashley glanced around and suddenly realized every curious face in the room had quietly turned toward them instead of Marcus and Eleanor. The attention they had hoped to place on someone else had returned to them. Eleanor slowly lifted her eyes toward Marcus. In all the years since Richard's passing, many people had complimented her accomplishments, admired her generosity, or praised her foundation. Very few had defended her dignity without expecting anything in return. For the first time that evening, she stopped wondering why fate had brought her to this table and began wondering whether some unexpected moments entered a person's life not to embarrass them, but to remind them that genuine character still existed. For several long seconds after Travis and Ashley walked away, neither Marcus nor Eleanor felt any need to rescue the silence. The music returned to the foreground. Glasses clinked softly around the dining room, and conversations resumed as though the interruption had never happened. Marcus watched the candle flicker between them before offering a faint smile. "I hope they eventually understand that dignity is not something another person can take away." Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully. "That is an unusually peaceful response." Marcus shrugged gently. "Anger usually gives the loudest person another chance to speak. I would rather spend my energy listening." Eleanor laughed quietly. "I suppose that explains why this evening feels nothing like I expected." She reached for her water glass, but as she adjusted the edge of her napkin, the silver oak leaf brooch slipped from her dress and landed softly against the table before sliding toward Marcus. He caught it carefully before it reached the floor. "I am sorry," Eleanor said with an embarrassed smile. "The clasp has been loose for years." Marcus turned the little brooch over in his palm before handing it back. At first it seemed like nothing more than a beautifully crafted piece of silver. Then, his eyes paused on the tiny pattern carved into the veins of the leaf. Something stirred somewhere deep inside his memory. Not a complete recollection, but a feeling. He had seen that design before. Perhaps on an old document. Perhaps in a photograph. Perhaps somewhere inside a life that now belonged mostly to memory. He did not immediately understand why it felt familiar. Eleanor noticed the subtle change in his expression. "Does it remind you of something?" she asked. Marcus looked up. "May I ask where it came from?" Eleanor fastened it back onto her dress with practiced care. "It was a gift from a young teacher many years ago. She had received one of our scholarships and insisted I keep it. I have worn it ever since." Marcus nodded slowly. The word scholarship lingered in his thoughts. A quiet image surfaced almost against his will. Rachel sitting at their old kitchen table, surrounded by application forms. Rachel laughing through tears while holding an acceptance letter. Rachel carefully folding every document back into its envelope because, as she often said, gratitude deserved respect. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. Marcus rested his hands on the table. "May I ask another question?" Eleanor smiled. "Of course." Was the scholarship connected to the Whitmore Scholars Foundation? She looked mildly surprised. "Yes." Marcus waited another moment before speaking again. Were you involved with the foundation? Eleanor answered without hesitation. I founded it almost 20 years ago. Marcus did not react the way many people probably expected someone to react after discovering they were sitting across from a woman whose name appeared on buildings, scholarship programs, and charitable organizations across the state. He did not lean forward with excitement. He did not ask about her influence, her success, or her wealth. Instead, he simply nodded, absorbing the information with quiet respect. That explains something, he said softly. Eleanor tilted her head. What does it explain? Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. My wife received a scholarship from your foundation years ago. She never spoke about the money first. She always spoke about the faith someone placed in her before she had accomplished anything. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Marcus reached into his wallet and removed a small photograph with edges softened by time. He placed it gently on the table. It showed Rachel smiling outside an elementary school on her first day as a teacher, sunlight catching her face, while a familiar silver oak leaf rested near the collar of her blouse. She kept that symbol close, Marcus said quietly. She used to say it reminded her that opportunity could travel farther than generosity ever imagined. Eleanor studied the photograph for several long seconds. Something about the young woman's face tugged unexpectedly at the edge of her memory. It was not recognition exactly. It was the uncomfortable feeling that she had once known a story connected to that smile, but had somehow misplaced it among countless years of meetings, ceremonies, and handwritten letters. She searched her thoughts, hoping a name or a conversation would suddenly return, but nothing came. Marcus gently returned the photograph to his wallet without saying anything more. The conversation moved naturally toward ordinary subjects again, as though neither of them wished to force meaning onto a moment that had not yet revealed its purpose. Yet Eleanor found herself glancing at Marcus more than once as the evening continued. He had learned she was the founder of a respected foundation, but nothing about his manner had changed. He remained the same thoughtful father who listened before speaking, thanked every waiter by name, and treated kindness as though it required no audience. As she watched him quietly fold his napkin before reaching for his water glass, a strange thought settled into her heart. She could not remember where she had seen the woman in that photograph, but she was suddenly certain that somewhere in the forgotten corners of her past waited a memory she should never have allowed herself to lose. Before either of them could continue the conversation, Marcus's phone vibrated against the edge of the table. He glanced at the screen, and Eleanor noticed the quiet warmth in his expression disappear, replaced by the focused calm of a father whose priorities had never required a second thought. The call was from Mrs. Harper, the retired librarian who watched Lily whenever his workday stretched longer than expected. Marcus answered immediately. Mrs. Harper, is everything all right? Her reassuring voice came through the speaker. Lily is safe, Marcus, but I think you should come to Jefferson Elementary. The principal asked me to bring her back after the reading club. There was a misunderstanding with another student, and she keeps asking for you. Marcus stood before the call had even ended. Thank you for staying with her. I will be there as quickly as I can. He slipped the phone into his pocket and reached for his jacket without the slightest hesitation. Eleanor recognized that look. She had seen board members interrupt meetings for business emergencies and donors excuse themselves for urgent calls, but this was different. Nothing about Marcus suggested inconvenience. He was simply going where his daughter needed him most. Lily, Eleanor asked softly. Marcus nodded. She needs her father. Before he could ask for the check, another familiar voice interrupted from beside the table. Mom. Daniel Whitmore stood there in a navy suit with his briefcase still in one hand, looking tired from the drive from Charlotte, but visibly relieved to see Eleanor safe. She blinked in surprise. Daniel, what are you doing here? He smiled apologetically. You shared your location this afternoon. When I realized you were meeting someone you had never met before, I thought I would stop by afterward. I hope you are not upset. Eleanor reached over and touched his arm. I am not upset, only surprised. Daniel turned toward Marcus and offered a respectful handshake. Daniel Whitmore. Marcus Reed. The handshake was firm but cautious. Daniel had spent years watching strangers discover who his mother was before deciding they suddenly wanted to know her. He had seen polite conversations become investment proposals, friendly dinners become requests for donations, and compliments quietly transform into calculated opportunities. It had made him protective, sometimes more than he realized. Before either man could say anything else, Travis wandered back from the bar carrying an uneasy smile. Gone was the confidence he had worn earlier. Instead, he seemed almost determined to convince himself that his joke had not gone too far. "Looks like I arrived just in time," he said lightly. "Daniel, I figured you should know your mother found herself quite an interesting date tonight." Eleanor's expression cooled immediately. "Travis, this is not the time." He lifted both hands slightly. "I am only making conversation." Then he looked toward Daniel. "Marcus owns a woodworking shop across town. Talented guy. Business has been a little rough lately, though. You know how things are. Sometimes people just need the right opportunity." Marcus said nothing. He had no interest in defending himself against assumptions. His thoughts drifted instead to the abandoned neighborhood library where unfinished bookshelves still waited beneath drop cloths. Rachel had once stood inside that forgotten building and whispered that every neighborhood deserved a place where children could dream for free. After she passed away, Marcus quietly promised himself he would finish restoring it someday, even if it meant accepting smaller paychecks, delaying equipment upgrades, and working long after midnight. Very few people knew why money had become tight. Fewer still understood that every sacrifice carried Rachel's promise forward one board at a time. Daniel looked at Marcus carefully. "Is your business struggling?" Marcus answered with the same calm honesty that had defined him all evening. "Like most small businesses, some seasons are easier than others. I am fortunate that the work I care about most is still moving forward." Travis nodded awkwardly. "I did not mean anything by it. I only thought." His sentence faded away because even he seemed uncertain where it should end. Eleanor watched Marcus closely. He never rushed to explain himself. He never mentioned the library. He never used hardship to earn sympathy. Instead, he thanked Travis for checking in and calmly reached for his jacket. That simple response unsettled Eleanor far more than any dramatic confrontation could have. For the first time that evening, she found herself questioning not Marcus's character, but Travis's version of the story. Before anyone spoke again, Marcus's phone vibrated once more. A message from Mrs. Harper appeared across the screen. "Lily is asking for you. She keeps saying she wishes she had handled everything differently." Marcus slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Please excuse me," he said. "My daughter comes first." Daniel looked toward the restaurant entrance, then back at Marcus. Years of protecting his mother made the question come naturally. Leaving now might make this situation look suspicious. Marcus paused only long enough to meet his eyes with quiet certainty before answering. A child needing her father is never suspicious. He turned toward the door. Eleanor picked up her purse without hesitation and walked beside him, while Daniel remained standing in silence, watching them disappear into the night with a feeling he had not expected. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering whether his instincts had protected his mother so often that they had also taught him to doubt a genuinely good man. The drive to Jefferson Elementary passed in quiet conversation, but the silence never felt uncomfortable. Marcus sat beside Eleanor watching the familiar streets slip past the windows, his thoughts already with Lily rather than the evening they had left behind. Eleanor noticed something she had rarely seen in people under pressure. He was not rehearsing explanations. He was not worrying about appearances. Every part of him seemed focused on one simple question. Was his daughter all right? When they pulled into the school parking lot, Mrs. Harper was waiting beneath the front entrance canopy with Lily standing beside her. The little girl looked exhausted, her backpack resting at her feet while she twisted one shoulder strap nervously between her fingers. The moment she saw Marcus, she hurried toward him. He knelt without saying a word, opening his arms. Lily stepped into the embrace and buried her face against his shoulder before whispering, "I am sorry, Daddy." Marcus gently brushed her hair away from her face. "Tell me what happened." Lily hesitated before speaking. "A boy said Mom left because she did not love us anymore. I told him she went to heaven because she was sick, but he laughed and said people only leave families they do not want. I pushed his backpack away because I wanted him to stop talking." Marcus listened without interrupting. "Did anyone get hurt?" She shook her head. "No." His books fell on the floor. Marcus nodded. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Inside the principal's office, the events unfolded exactly as Mrs. Harper had described. The principal acknowledged that the other students' words had been deeply inappropriate, but also explained that Lily should not have responded by pushing the backpack. Marcus accepted both truths without trying to erase either one. He turned toward Lily and spoke with the same calm voice she had trusted since childhood. Your heart was hurting, and I understand that. But another person's unkindness never gets to decide who you become. Tomorrow you will apologize for pushing the backpack because we always take responsibility for our own choices. Lily lowered her eyes. Will he have to apologize too? Marcus looked toward the principal before answering. That decision belongs to the adults, but every child deserves to learn that words can leave scars even when nobody sees them. The principal quietly agreed and promised the school would address both sides of the incident. As they walked back toward the parking lot, Eleanor remained unusually quiet. She had attended leadership seminars, parenting conferences, and countless charity events over the years, yet she had rarely witnessed someone balance compassion and accountability with such effortless grace. Marcus had defended Lily without pretending she was faultless. He had corrected her without diminishing her dignity. That quiet strength lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after they reached the car. On the drive home, Lily slowly relaxed, occasionally answering Eleanor's gentle questions about school, favorite library books, and the white gardenia she had given her father that morning. By the time they reached the small blue house on Maple Street, the tension had softened into something warmer. Marcus unlocked the front door and smiled toward Lily. Would you help Mrs. Harper find the cookie tin in the kitchen? Lily nodded eagerly and disappeared with the older woman toward the back of the house. Marcus then turned toward Eleanor. There is something I would like to show you. He walked to a narrow cabinet in the hallway and carefully lifted out an old cedar box covered with a thin layer of dust. The wood had darkened with age, and the brass hinges showed the quiet wear of years spent protecting precious memories. He carried it to the dining table with both hands, setting it down almost reverently before opening the lid. Inside rested a lifetime preserved in careful order. There were faded photographs tied with twine, report cards, pressed wildflowers tucked between notebook pages, handwritten recipes, church bulletins, a tiny pair of knitted baby shoes, and several envelopes bundled together beneath a faded blue ribbon. Eleanor reached first toward a photograph resting near the top. It showed a young woman standing beneath the entrance sign of a small elementary school, smiling with the unmistakable pride of someone beginning the career she had dreamed about for years. Another picture showed the same woman kneeling beside a classroom reading to children gathered around her. A third captured her laughing beside Marcus while they painted the nursery before Lily was born. Eleanor studied each image carefully. Something about the woman's face stirred an uneasy familiarity she could not explain. It was not recognition exactly. It was more like hearing the first few notes of a melody she had once known by heart. Marcus quietly picked up a worn classroom identification badge and smiled to himself before placing it back inside the box. Rachel believed every child deserved someone who never stopped believing in them, he said softly. Eleanor continued turning over the keepsakes one by one. A folded school newsletter, a graduation program, a handwritten grocery list with a small heart sketched beside Marcus's name. Every object revealed another gentle piece of a woman she had somehow never met, yet whose kindness seemed strangely familiar. Finally, her fingers reached the bundle of letters secured beneath the faded blue ribbon. She hesitated before sliding the ribbon aside just enough to lift the top page. The signature at the bottom caught her eye first. Rachel Reed. Eleanor froze. The room around her seemed to fade into silence. Somewhere deep inside her memory, a locked door shifted ever so slightly. She could not remember the story, but she knew she had seen that name before. Not in a newspaper. Not at a ceremony. Somewhere personal. Somewhere important. She slowly returned the letter to the cedar box and closed the lid with unusual care. As Marcus walked Mrs. Harper and Lily toward the front porch, Eleanor remained standing beside the table, her heartbeat unexpectedly quicker than before. Moments later, she thanked Marcus quietly, stepped outside into the cool evening air, and walked to her car with only one thought filling her mind. Back at her lake house, inside the fireproof safe in her study, there was an old, unopened memory waiting for her, and for the first time in many years she knew she could no longer leave it there. The rain had stopped by the time Eleanor reached her lake house. The quiet felt different now, no longer empty but unfinished. She walked straight to the study without turning on the lights. The familiar fireproof safe waited behind a framed landscape painting, untouched for years except for moments she was not yet ready to revisit. She entered the combination from memory, lifted the heavy door, and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope whose edges had softened with time. For years she had convinced herself that leaving it unopened was an act of respect. Tonight it felt more like unfinished responsibility. The following afternoon, she drove back to the blue house on Maple Street. Marcus answered the door, surprised but welcoming, while Lily greeted Eleanor with the same open smile she had offered on the night of the blind date. Eleanor held out the envelope with both hands. "I think this has waited long enough," she said quietly. Marcus accepted it without asking questions. They sat together at the small dining table where sunlight spilled across the cedar box that still rested. Nearby, he unfolded the letter carefully. Every line spoke with kindness rather than regret. Eleanor had written years earlier that Rachel's compassion, patience, and gift for encouraging children represented exactly the future she had hoped the Whitmore Scholars Foundation would help create. Near the end, Marcus paused. The final paragraph expressed a hope that Rachel would continue shaping young lives both inside and beyond the classroom, because people like her change communities one child at a time. Marcus lowered the letter and remained silent for several moments. He did not cry. Instead, he traced Rachel's signature on one of the old photographs beside the cedar box before looking toward the kitchen window where the afternoon light rested across the garden outside. "She would have loved knowing someone believed in her this much," he finally whispered. Lily slipped her small hand into his. "She still knows," she said with quiet certainty. That evening, after Eleanor had left, Marcus remained alone in the living room while Lily slept upstairs. He picked up the framed photograph of Rachel from the bookshelf and sat beside the window. Outside, the single gardenia bush Lily cared for each spring swayed gently in the evening breeze. Marcus smiled at the picture. "I promised I would keep living," he said softly. "I thought that promise meant surviving. Maybe it meant something bigger." He placed the photograph back exactly where it had always been. Nothing had been replaced. Nothing had been forgotten. Some loves simply became the foundation that allowed new chapters to exist without erasing the old ones. Eleanor had returned to her car, but paused before starting the engine. Through the front window, she happened to see Marcus quietly returning Rachel's photograph to its place with both hands. She looked away almost immediately, understanding that some moments were gifts simply because no one interrupted them. In that silent instant, she realized she had never been asked to compete with a memory. She was only being invited into a life where love had already taught people how to be kind. During the following weeks, news of the events at Ashford House quietly spread through the company. After reviewing witness statements and security footage, management concluded that arranging the dinner as entertainment had crossed a professional line. Travis accepted responsibility and later visited Marcus's workshop in person. "I kept telling myself it was harmless," he admitted. "I never stopped to ask whether either of you would have to carry the embarrassment after everyone else went home." Marcus accepted the apology with a simple handshake. Learning from a mistake matters more than pretending it never happened. Daniel arrived a few days later. Standing among unfinished bookshelves inside the workshop, he looked around at stacks of carefully labeled lumber and children's reading tables waiting for their final coat of finish. "I owe you an apology," he said honestly. "Too many people have tried to get close to my mother because of her name. After a while I stopped seeing individuals and started seeing patterns. That was unfair to you." Marcus smiled. "Protecting family is rarely the wrong instinct. We just have to remember every new person deserves the chance to become their own story." Daniel nodded, carrying those words with him when he left. Eleanor never offered to pay for the restoration of the neighborhood library. Instead, she introduced the project to teachers, local businesses, former scholarship recipients, and community organizations that believed every child deserved a welcoming place to read. Volunteers arrived on weekends carrying paintbrushes, books, donated furniture, and endless encouragement. Marcus continued building every shelf with the same quiet care he had always given his work, knowing each board honored a promise Rachel once whispered inside the abandoned building. Months later, sunlight poured through the windows of the restored Rachel Reed Learning House as children explored colorful reading corners while retired teachers read aloud beneath handmade oak bookshelves. Marcus watched a little boy carefully return a book to one of the shelves he had built and smiled without saying anything. Nearby, Eleanor noticed a former scholarship recipient helping children choose their first library cards. The kindness Rachel had once received had quietly reached another generation. Outside, beneath the broad branches of an old oak tree, 3 wooden chairs overlooked the entrance. Before anyone sat down, Lily reached into a small basket she carried and removed a single white gardenia. She gently placed it on the middle chair for just a moment, then looked toward her father. "Mom always said flowers help people feel safe," she said with a thoughtful smile. "Now I think they also remind people they are already home." Marcus looked at the flower, then at Eleanor. His smile came slowly, carrying gratitude instead of certainty. "Would you let me take you to dinner sometime?" he asked. Not because someone arranged it. Not because anyone expects anything. Simply because I would like to know where the conversation goes. Eleanor smiled back. "I would like that." Lily picked up the gardenia, tucked it gently behind her ear, and took one hand from each of them as the 3 sat beneath the oak tree. From inside the library came the quiet sound of children reading aloud together, their voices drifting through the open windows like the beginning of another story. While the evening light settled softly across the handmade shelves, the blooming gardenias, and the home that kindness had patiently built.